One of the things that really shocked me in doing a lot of my research is that over 80% of autoimmune diseases are found in women. Women can take 5, 10 years to get the proper diagnosis, particularly if this is during their childbearing years or they have young children. They may be told that they're tired or they have joint pain or they're weak from the balance of work, life, stress, when really they had a treatable condition. The more we value women, the more we invest in women, I think the better off our society will be.
So why do you think women get the medical brush off?
I think there's a long, long history of women being dismissed, invalidated, not understood for their bodies, and really presenting at the doctor with potentially years of symptoms that have been ignored. And there's really never been in the history of Western medicine any narrative about women's health that has been equivalent to, as powerful as that which you see with men. Sometimes it's been egregious, and other times I think it's been more insidious in curiosity about what it means to be a woman, what it means to have female specific conditions.
So you mentioned at times it's been egregious. What's the most egregious example you can think of?
Oh, there are over 800 citations in my book, and I probably feel like I could have written 10 more just of what I painfully read throughout history. I mean, women have been tortured. Women have been really, their bodies have been experimented on. There's countless stories. I think some of the more painful ones are when you look at particularly minorities in this country and you look at the history of gynecology in the United States. Some of the biggest advances which have changed the history of gynecology in the United States, for example, fistulas, which are basically tears between different parts of the body, whether it's like the rectum and the vagina after childbirth. The advances in correcting that damage, where women might have been literally urinating on themselves, having fecal incontinence after childbirth indefinitely. Those advances were made in part by the founding father, we call the founding father of gynecology in the United States, Dr. Marion Sims. But he did that work on Black female slaves with no anesthesia. So there's a very complicated history in the United States of the types of advances that have been made, how they were made, and who were the really founding mothers of our country.
And so there's a lot. You mentioned the 800 citations, and the book is filled with these powerful stories, which or references in medical literature. Many of them are just astounding, horrifying, insane. I'll start with the insane. I'll start with a little bit where
Well, we're insane. We're hormonal. We're crazy. You can't figure us out. You can't study us because we're just bonkers. And we're definitely hysterical.
and there was a lot that stood out to me, and one where I chuckled was medical literature around cycling from like 200 years ago. Let's talk about that one.
Not even, was it really 200 years ago? Really more at the turn of the century. So the turn of the 19th century, bicycles were a fascinating, new, exciting hobby, right? You could leave your home and go a pretty good distance, and you didn't need a chaperone. You didn't need a horse and buggy. It wasn't a train, and you didn't have to pay for a ticket. You just needed a bike. However, the bike became the symbol of this broader movement of liberation. If you look at the suffragists, a lot of times they were pictured with a bicycle. But as much as our medical history reflects societal history, cultural influences, religious influences, and what people felt about women at the time, it is not surprising that some of the most famous medical journals, such as the Journal of American Medical Association, came out with articles about whether women should actually be bike riding. This trickled down into every newspaper about the do's and don'ts of what women could and could not do. And the concern was that they might develop bulky muscles, their face might be frozen in a grimace, such as what they called bicycle face, from this exertion that only women would suffer from. And of course, the greatest, most horrible thing that could happen is that you would masturbate on the bike. So, I mean, this must speak to SoulCycle and Peloton and all our listeners that are just riding it till the wheels fall off.
So this one stood out. You mentioned this was JAMA, the journal. Like, this is one of the most credible medical journals in the world today, from my understanding. So I can't help but think science is a process, and we often may have a hypothesis that something may be good for us and may end up being bad and vice versa. And so I'm thinking, okay, we're in 2024. What's the bicycling of JAMA in 2024? What's something we're making a really bad call on right now that in 20 years from now or 100 years from now, we're going to look back and say, this is insane?
It's a fantastic question, and it obviously speaks to my passion for the history of medicine and understanding the relationship between medicine and our bodies and society. I think what's so important about your question is that we begin to ask that question, right? And understand that science and all of this discovery doesn't happen in a vacuum. And how do we change what we know we will look back on in Monday night quarterbacking, say, what could we have done differently? I think the problem with the way that the medical system was built historically is that women did not have a seat at the table. We weren't really listening to women and their concerns, and there were not female practitioners because in some instances you couldn't even go to medical school. So midwives and whatnot who had centuries of legacy of taking care of women were sidelined when they couldn't even go to medical school. So the good news is today we have, more than greater than 50% of women graduating medical schools, but we have to make sure that women are in positions of power and that there is a diversity of spirit in terms of academic medicine, scientific pursuit, and that we take the time to listen to women. In terms of modern day examples, I think one really interesting, controversial one that I talk about in the book is the COVID vaccine. So I am an oncologist. I was, desperate to get the COVID vaccine, and I'm glad that I did. And I believe in modern medicine, and I truly believe that it has saved lives. But when we look at how those trials were conducted, one of the most important things that lay women look at, particularly if they're menstruating, is how is my menstrual cycle? Because they see that, many women do, as a reflection of their well-being, right? If they are stressed out, that may be delayed. They may have concerns about fertility. When the vaccine came out, some women were reported anecdotally, that their periods were being delayed. They were concerned about their fertility. But there was no endpoint in the clinical trials to say, well, we've already given this to women. We know that it can, like many other immunizations, affect your period for 1 or 2 cycles, but it's not going to affect your fertility. Instead, what happened is many of these women were told, you're crazy, don't worry about it. It's not going to affect your fertility. Now, it did not. But had we included this as an endpoint in the clinical trials, we might have been more reassuring to women that this is safe, this is a good thing. We know that many pregnant women died of COVID, and that's a huge, huge, huge problem. So I think that we are doing better today, but we still need to be mindful of how we do preclinical research, how we conduct research, that we listen to women, and that all the way through the medical and scientific process, we include women along the way.
Yeah, without going down the COVID rabbit hole, suffice to say, I think there's a lot we could have done better, and history will probably not reflect kindly on how we handled that one.
I think it's about doing the best that we can, and doing the best that we can means being inclusive and recognizing that science is you do the best that you can in any given moment. But historically, we did not.
And I think science is not a noun; it should be a verb.
Yes.
And I think that's a little bit of a and science, yeah. This is a pain point for a lot of people right now. And just to build off of women and how far we've come, women used to be viewed as just quote unquote small men, and this is within the medical community, which is again insane. Feels like we've come a long way there.
Yeah. We have and we haven't. It was not until 1993 that the NIH required that women and minorities be included in clinical trials. Many of the major studies for heart disease, cholesterol medications, aspirin were done on men, for example, and the assumption was that we would just dose it differently for women. And we know, as we've discussed, that head to toe, women are not small men. We present differently with diseases. It's not just about our breast and our uterus, but whether it's neurologic disorders, autoimmune disorders, heart disease. It's staggering that heart disease is the #1 killer of women, and we are still playing catch up in terms of understanding the way that women present with heart disease. When I was in medical school, we were taught that women's symptoms of heart attack were atypical, yet were greater than 50% of the population. That's absolutely ridiculous calculus to teach students and future doctors that the way women present is the atypical version of how men present when it is the number one killer of women. We also have very different biology in terms of heart disease. A lot of what we present with is more small vessel disease, which is different to visualize than what you might visualize in a man. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done, and that includes from a research perspective, but also who, again, has a seat at the table and who are the doctors treating patients. One of the things, in medicine that's fascinating is if you look at some of the fields, there are still many, many fields of medicine which are underrepresented for women. So a field like cardiology, where one subspecialty of that is electrophysiology, which looks at the rhythm of the heart. So a couple really important things are how hard the heart can pump out blood, but also the rhythm of the heart, that lub dub that we talk about. Those arrhythmias are treated by electrophysiologists. The percentage of women that are electrophysiologists is extremely small in the United States. It's just one example, whether it's urology, orthopedic surgery, of different areas of medicine that we need to make sure that women can also see female providers if they so choose.
So you mentioned heart disease, still the number one killer, yet symptoms present themselves in very different ways for women. Can we spend a moment there educating women on what they should be on the lookout for? Because it is different.
It is different. I think one thing that's important is that if a woman has any history of heart disease in the family that they know of, any sudden death, any early onset stroke, any history of blood clots, it's very important that they talk to their doctor about a family history that may impact their future presentation of disease. There can be all sorts of different things, whether it's unexplained fatigue, whether it's nausea, whether it's jaw pain, it can be left arm pain, symptoms of indigestion. But the point is, if a woman is not feeling okay, she has to have a doctor that she can connect with that may need to do an EKG, may need to do a stress test. We need to make sure that women feel connected to their doctors and that they can talk to them and ask them directly, what should I be on the lookout for?
Well, I'm glad you mentioned the jaw pain and some of the fatigue. And the message isn't to freak out every woman listening and who's tired and say, run to your run to the ER. But I do want to spend a moment here because there's that classic male symptom of like the left arm freezing.
Elephant on the chest.
Exactly. And that's not the way it is for women.
No, it may not be for women. Sometimes it can be, but changes in exertion, shortness of breath, if you notice that your exercise tolerance is different, if you feel any sense of palpitations, particularly postmenopausal women, perimenopausal women, there can be different presentations of disease. I think it's important that women be connected to a primary care doctor, have at least a checkup once a year, and talk to them about what are the things that I should be looking out for.
I'll give you a real world example. So my wife had a pulmonary embolism. God, I think it's 12 years ago. And it was shortness of breath, fatigue. And at the time, she gaslit herself. She said, I'm good. I just did a hard yoga class. And I remember taking the escalator up on the A train in Brooklyn. It was a very like steep escalator and she had to sit. I'm like, no, 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 like this isn't normal. Like, and my wife is very tough. She's hard on herself. I'm okay. And I was like, no, 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 you're going to the doctor on Monday. Sure enough, she had a PE. She's very lucky to be alive. Showers of clots. Was after a flight a week ago, but she was also on the birth control pill. And it was one of the brands, I forget which one, that had a link to clotting. And it was just something she never thought about in her 20s, never asked about. She was in her 30s. But, gaslit herself essentially. Thank God she's okay. But I think it's a good example, like the symptoms to look out for and the need to ask questions. When she first, the birth control is empowering and but there are side effects. And it was something in retrospect she wished she would have asked more questions about.
My heart is sinking right now because as a doctor who's been in emergency rooms, cared for many, I'm an oncologist, which cancer puts women at risk for clots. I am so glad to hear your wife is alive. For people that are listening right there, what's called a saddle pulmonary embolus or multiple pulmonary emboli can be truly life-threatening, and I have seen women die from this. Serena Williams talks about this when she gave birth, that, she was short of breath, she was told she was anxious, she was gaslit in the medical setting. It is extremely common. And I think there is a narrative also about women enduring pain, feeling like they have to tough things out, taking care of other people, setting themselves on fire just to keep everybody else around them warm. I'm, guilty of this myself. And we need to allow the space in our society for women to be able to take care of themselves. And I'm so glad that you were her advocate for her. So few women are in those instances where they have anybody that can really say, you're not okay. And I'm going to be there for you. And I got you. And I'm going to make sure you go to the doctor. So this wasn't just about her. This was about your teamwork together. And what an amazing story of connection. And I'm so glad that you saved her life.
Well, I don't know if I'll take all that credit, but we're very happy she's.
You knew she wasn't okay. You knew she wasn't okay. So I'm going to give you that credit. And you made sure she got the help that she needed. And I've seen it go in many other different directions. So I will valorize you in that instance. She may have gaslit herself, but you didn't allow it to continue. So thank you.
Well, you're very kind. And so something else that I think, and you write about in the book, the medical system tends to blame it on the hormones.
Yeah.
Not cool.
Not cool. Men have hormones too. Look at how many violent interactions happen after men lose, their favorite sporting team loses, or domestic violence that happens after their favorite soccer team, right? Those spike. What's that from? I mean, is testosterone only this amazing hormone? And by the way, women have testosterone too. This assumption, when you look at the history of the investigation, the discovery of hormones, it was largely a binary effort. That there was going to be one thing that made women crazy and hysterical and one thing that made men virile and strong. Well, guess what? Women have testosterone and men have estrogen too. When you look at the history of how this binary influence really impacted our study of hormones, it meant that even today, when we talk about hormone replacement therapy, we have no idea whether we can really give women testosterone, how much estrogen, progesterone we should be using. And in many instances, it goes both ways for men as well. So there's a lot of catch up that needs to happen. When I was in medical school, and certainly I think up until 2006, I may get this wrong, you may not, or many of the studies, we didn't have to report the gender, the sex of the mice that you were using in your experiments, which is fascinating because how can you then translate that data and presume what you know about men or women?
Right. And that's an area too. Hormone therapy is one I think many are excited about. The science is changing there for men and women, and how there are some will go as far that say, hormone health is health, period. And that there is direct correlation with longevity, and that it can be protective, and there are so many benefits, and it's changing rapidly. But at the same time, we have a problem there for men and women who are suffering hormonally way too young.
Yeah. So you're speaking my world and my language. So when I was in beginning, when you look at the history of hormone replacement therapy, when it initially came out, particularly for women, you had all these women on it, right? Maybe not even necessarily for the right reasons, but you did. Then the pendulum struck in the other direction that this was horrible for you. Everyone was going to get breast cancer. And certainly during my training, that was the assumption that this was going to promote breast cancer. And now we're swinging in the other direction, really understanding that it's an individual decision. There may be a lot of benefit for some women. It may not be the right thing, but there are different ways to approach hormonal therapy. In my world, we essentially medically castrate many young women in their 20s and 30s as part of their treatment for breast cancer. We either remove or shut down their ovaries because their cancer may in part be driven by estrogen. It's only recently that we've been able to show that, for example, intravaginal estrogen is not absorbed systemically, but can help with a lot of sexual side effects. It can help with a lot of general urinary pain that some women have. The fact that we are just in 2024 telling women this is insane. Not to mention that studies across the board show that many oncologists are still afraid to recommend this and don't understand the science that we can actually give it to some of these breast cancer patients. So it's an example of, in my world, we have so many women that we say, okay, you're alive. We're giving you this great therapy that's saving your life, but I've made your life miserable in the process. And your vagina feels like sandpaper. It doesn't have to.
So in terms of breast cancer, where are we in 2024 with methods for early detection, with options for those diagnosed and options for those on the other side of it who've gotten through?
So let me break it down in terms of early detection. There is ample evidence through and through that early detection saves lives, not only saves lives, but also decreases the chance of an invasive process. So, a more invasive therapy needed and more invasive treatment needed. It's not just about saving the life, but minimizing the type of treatment and de escalating. So, for an average risk woman, we want to make sure that we're offering mammograms and potentially ultrasounds if they have dense breasts starting at age 40. And I believe in yearly testing. Some women may need earlier testing than that if they have a strong family history, a genetic mutation, or other risk factors that may suggest that they need to start screening earlier than age 40. Some instances we add on MRIs, which may be helpful as well for detecting early cancers. Over 14,000 women under the age of 40 are diagnosed with breast cancer every year. We need to do better for this unmet need because many of these women, we don't have adequate screening because mammograms don't work so well. We don't know why the incidence is necessarily rising. Many of these women are finding their own cancers or their partner is when they notice that something's wrong, which means that it's palpable as opposed to something that's microscopic that can be treated with less invasive therapy. For those women that are diagnosed with breast cancer, this is one of the fields of medicine that has actually had tremendous advances in the last 20 years. We are indeed saving more lives. We don't know why younger women are being diagnosed more, but we are actually doing better overall. For women who have metastatic disease, which means that the breast cancer has spread from their breast to another part of the body, and we call that stage 4 breast cancer, which has a really scary diagnosis to it. We know that I have some patients that have been alive for 20, 25 years with what we call metastatic breast cancer to their bones, for example, or other parts of their body. They may have gotten 10 different treatments over the last 10 years, and they're still alive and they're feeling well. So it's one area where we have invested not just government funding, but tremendous amounts of philanthropy and academic data to show that we can improve the lives of women.
So for those who have the BRCA gene and who are at a higher risk, there are a couple ways to think about this one. One is very aggressive. I think Angelina Jolie kind of put this on the map, which just said double mastectomy, I'm done, which is a very aggressive, maybe not necessary way to approach it. For those who aren't interested in that, what do you recommend in terms of check-ins, to just keep on top of it? Because unfortunately, some people, we don't believe your genetics, your destiny, period.
Right. So, well, no, we are a mix. No one has dealt with a perfect deck of cards and a perfect set of genes. We're all born with varying degrees of risk and not risk for different conditions. Let's just back up even further and clarify what is BRCA1 and what is BRCA2. These are two different sets of two different genes. You can have mutations in these genes that are associated with an increased risk of not only breast cancer, but in some instances, ovarian cancer. But most importantly, you need to know that you can inherit increased risk of cancer from both your mother or your father's side. So, if, for example, on your father's side, there are no women relatives that had any cancer, but tons of prostate cancer and pancreatic cancer, they actually may be passing down a genetic mutation that could be associated with an increased risk of breast cancer. When we look at family histories right now, it's very important that it's not just BRCA1 and BRCA2 that we can test for. There are many, many, many other genes that we can test for. And while BRCA1 and BRCA2 are associated with among the highest increased risk of breast cancer, they are not the only ones. So when you talk to your doctor about whether genetic testing is appropriate, it's important to know, can you investigate your family history on both sides? Can you do a more full and complete panel of what genes you may be at risk for? So it depends, again, when you talk about preventative interventions, it really depends on the person, what's going to keep them up at night, how they feel about their body, what age they are. It may also impact the family history of the family, whether there was a lot of early onset cancer. So for some women with a known increased risk of breast cancer, such as BRCA1 or BRCA2, and we say that on average, you have an 85% increased risk of breast cancer over X many years. Some women may not want to live with that psychology and may choose a bilateral mastectomy. If they're done having children, they may consider what's called an oophorectomy, taking out their ovaries if they're at risk for ovarian cancer. There are lots of different options. The key here is that women talk to a genetic counselor and someone who is really, really schooled in what their options are, both from a physical perspective as well as a screening perspective. Some women with an increased risk of breast cancer may choose increased surveillance, such as with MRIs and other imaging modalities.
Really great advice. And it seems like this is an area where we've come quite far. And with that said, are there other areas of women's health where you think we probably have a long way to go in terms of diagnosis?
I think there's lots of areas where we have a long way to go. One of the things that really shocked me in doing a lot of my research is that over 80% of autoimmune diseases are found in women. Women can take 5, 10 years to get the proper diagnosis, particularly if this is during their childbearing years or they have young children. They may be told that they're tired or they have joint pain or they're weak from the balance of work, life, stress, when really they had a treatable condition. And yet there are so many other areas where I think we're doing better. Things like orthopedic injuries that I tore my ACL when I was 14 years old. I was an avid dancer and athlete, and I was told, well, let's just see how active you are over time. And, years later, not wearing a knee brace, I fractured a bone, I tore another ligament, I tore my meniscus. And probably all of that could have been avoided had I had the proper surgery and proper physical therapy. It's very different now for women in sports. We're also learning a lot more about concussions and different injuries that women may present with, and we are doing better. But overall, I think if you ask any woman what their experience has been in the medical system, I think they'd say, and I would agree, we have a long way to go.
Except maybe in women's sports. Wow. It's awesome, huh?
Yeah, it is awesome. It is awesome. It is awesome. The more we value women, the more we invest in women, I think the better off our society will be. It's one thing that, a lot of people say, well, what is the value of women's health, right? If you don't care at all about women, but you care about your wallet and you care about your paycheck at the end of the day, recognize that women are the primary caregivers of society. We are the primary providers of healthcare. We are the primary consumers of healthcare. So the more we invest in keeping women healthy, including women as they age, the better our economy will be, the better our workforce will be. There's an economic massive advantage to investing in women's healthcare. And I think that's the other movement that you're seeing right now. And it's not just about like our vaginal health, but literally our health head to toe, including our minds. Alzheimer's disease is 2 times more likely in women than in men. 2/3 of Alzheimer's patients are women. Why are we forgetting about the aging brain in women? That's a problem.
Jason Walkup here, founder and co-CEO of mindbodygreen and the host of the mindbodygreen podcast. Please subscribe. You'll never miss a show and you won't regret it. And this idea that the medical establishment tends to gaslight women is just astounding to me. And this hit home a long time ago. I had a kidney stone, and it was like the most painful thing I had ever experienced in my life. And I've had some injuries. Felt like I was being stabbed in the stomach. I was keeling over in pain. I was vomiting. I thought I was gonna die. It was god awful. That's just for a man who cannot understand the pain of childbirth. That's a direct comp, and women are doing that day in and day out. For many women, multiple times.
Yes. Yes. And there is an assumption, and you see women minimizing their pain, underreporting their pain, because the assumption is we're meant to endure. There are women who have extraordinary painful periods or may have endometriosis that's taking years and years and years to be diagnosed. They have urinary symptoms, they have GI symptoms, they are suffering. And the assumption is, well, you're just suffer because you're a woman and your mom had it and your aunt had it and your sister had it, so it's just in your family, as opposed to actually offering women some of the help that they might be able to avail themselves of, or actually doing the research to figure out how we could help them better.
I think one of the most painful things, I can speak from personal experience, and I know lots of men and women have gone through this, when something is really wrong and they go to see a medical professional, and that medical professional says, "You're fine. Maybe you should see a psychiatrist," or "Maybe it's in your head," or "You're okay." And that is so much worse than often getting a very terrible diagnosis that's correct.
Well, I wish the title of my book, All in Her Head, didn't resonate with so many women. But when I speak, no matter where I go, it seems like every woman has a story of being told some version of calm down, you're just anxious, it's all in your head. I've had that happen to me. There's a story in the conclusion that I wrote my entire book and then literally experienced everything that I was advocating that women not go through. With all of my knowledge, I was writing a book and then it happened to me. So I think that so many women have had that experience. And part of it comes from, I think, a human instinct from physicians. even with the best of intentions of wanting to label something when they don't have the answer for it. That's pretty understandable. And so if you don't know and your ego kind of gets in the way, instead of digging deeper to think, well, let's believe the person in front of me, it's far easier to default to, well, something must be wrong with them because I can't figure it out.
Can you share your personal experience?
Of course, of course. So I don't go into as much detail in the conclusion of the book, but the backstory is I had for years been running and my left lower leg was feeling weaker and weaker and weaker. And I was seeing different physical therapists who were like, oh, but you can run 10 miles, you're fine. And they were kind of doing cursory exams. And I say it's my fault. I should have talked to a doctor about it. It was also during COVID. So I was very busy taking care of people in the hospital. Ultimately had a compressed nerve and I somehow bypassed the pain experience of having the compressed nerve and just got to the point where it was so weak that it was affecting the function of my foot and causing what's called drop foot. So I ultimately had surgery to repair that. And about 6 weeks later, I developed a horrible, horrible headache doesn't even describe it. But when I picked up my head, it felt like it was being sucked down into a vacuum into my spine. And I knew right away in retrospect that I must be leaking some spinal fluid from where I had the surgery because your brain is bathed in fluid, right? And that connects through your spine. So if you've had surgery on your spine or women who have had an epidural, for example, if there's a leak in that membrane, the fluid can leak out and therefore you have less fluid around your brain. Every time you pick your head up, it's like a vacuum and pulls down. So I was hosting a New Year's Eve party and I mentioned to a group of people there, you can see I'm trying to be careful about the details, that I thought I was leaking spinal fluid. And a surgeon there said to me, "You're effing crazy. That's ridiculous. That's not what could happen to you. This is what you have instead." And somebody else there called me a hypochondriac. And in the moment, I felt so embarrassed, so ashamed. I went and crawled into my bed and very long story short, only emailed my surgeon because I didn't want to bother him on a holiday. And then spent the next 4 days in excruciating pain, barely able to lift my head. By the time I got to the emergency room, oh, by the way, after being prescribed a steroid and Valium by phone, just to see if that would relax things, I had swelling around my brain and was admitted to the hospital for a while. I had to take medical leave. And in the end of the day, I was in extraordinary pain. I didn't believe myself, even though I knew immediately what was wrong with me because my headache was positional. When I got to the emergency room, I apologized to the nurse because I hadn't been able to shower in 4 days because I had been in so much pain and I was embarrassed that I wasn't wearing deodorant. So the first thing I said as I was trying to take my shirt off and change into the gown lying down was, "I'm so sorry. I probably smell because I haven't wore deodorant." And here I am with a lot of freaking medical knowledge, a lot of resources, everything that I should supposedly have at my fingertips for good health. And yet I apologized for my pain. I minimized it. I really harmed myself and I allowed other people to tell me what was wrong with me when I knew immediately what I thought was wrong.
I'm glad you're okay.
Thank you.
Could have killed you.
Maybe.
And why? I'm curious. So that it was a problem in the foot. How come the surgery ended up in the spine?
So it was a problem in the nerve that innervates that controls the foot.
Understood. On a lighter note, can we talk about the origins of plastic surgery?
Sure. Sure. Plastic
Which is
surgery is
also in
always
the
fun
book.
to talk about.
We're in Miami, so let's talk about the origins of plastic surgery.
Right. And let's be clear for anybody listening. I mean, my mother jokes that her middle name is Vanita. I am not against doing whatever women and men want to do to feel good in their bodies. The point of going over the history of plastic surgery was just to give a little bit of perspective about how the field was built and to think about when you show up for whatever procedure that you want, that you're thinking about the motivations behind it. Is this really empowering you? Are you subjecting yourself to impossibly punishing beauty standards? Who are you doing this for and who's deciding what options are available for you? And that includes everything from elective cosmetic surgery to the type of reconstruction surgery that we do in my field, such as breast cancer. So the history of plastic surgery is really fascinating because At the same time that war injuries were more catastrophic because you had the type of new weaponry during the different wars at the turn of the century, you also had the rise of anesthesia and the ability to operate on people without having to amputate a leg in 30 seconds or less, right? This also meant that plastic surgery, reconstructive surgery was born on the battlefield. And so instead of just necessarily operating on a man who couldn't chew because his jaw had been blown off by some new weaponry, you could also operate on a quote ugly woman so that she'd become more presentable to society. And you saw, I mean, we think about today shows like The History of the Swan. I don't know if you remember that, these like fantastic makeover stories. But even before that, there was a Dr. Crum in the 1930s who was doing facelifts on actresses in ballrooms in New York City. And you could go, and this was almost like a spectator sport, much like what we see in some version of social media today. But the history of plastic surgery was largely male plastic surgeons operating on women. And in that context, there's a very fine nuanced line of what's pathology here, right? Because it's not a kidney stone, it's not a cancer, right? We are taking a healthy person and making them better. But who's deciding what that better option is? Whether it's a man saying, I think you're going to look better with larger implants, and the woman wondering, well, maybe do I really need that? Or this is a man telling me that that's what's going to look better. There's all sorts of ways to break this down. But in the chapter, I talk about the history of breast implants. I talk about the rise of labiaplasties. This was not a common surgery that somehow we're doing much more often now. Like, what is a Barbie vagina? Google that. Where did this come from?
On the subject of breast implants, I know I'll preface with I know very little about this, but it seems like that's an area where we've come far in terms of the process and how women think about breast augmentation and the harms and the silicone and evolution.
You know, the history of breast implants, that's the opening of the plastic surgery chapter, is about this woman who went in to get tattoos removed and ended up getting breast implants that she never knew she wanted, never said she wanted, but ended up getting. And over the course of having them, it's very interesting. You can read about what she said. At some instances, this was just something that was done to her. In other instances, she was proud of it because she knew it also helped women who had a history of breast cancer. But the history of breast implants was not to help women who were having mastectomies. It was started by men who thought that, women would feel better if they had bigger breasts. So it's quite fascinating to me.
And how do women become better advocates, whether they're going in for cosmetic surgery or addressing something more serious? What general advice do you have? What are some of the questions they should ask when interviewing a medical professional? Because I do think it should be an interview.
Yes, I think when we're talking about plastic surgery in particular, take a beat. Take a beat to really think about, why are you doing this? What is the motivation behind it? Where are you at in your life? And if you feel like this is an empowering decision and something that is going to make you feel better about yourself, go for it. But if you're answering to some other calling or some other societal pressure that doesn't feel right in your gut, don't do it. Don't do it. And when you're interviewing physicians, make sure that you are being heard about what you want for yourself, not just what another person thinks is going to look good on you. I've definitely seen women in instances, including with breast reconstruction for breast cancer, feeling pressure that they had to have a certain type of surgery when in fact that wasn't the surgery that they wanted, and waking up and feeling not only, not right in their body, but that they had wished that they had made other decisions. Bring somebody with you who can also be an objective listener as well. And when we think about the broader context of medical advocacy beyond plastic surgery, you can have that gut check. You know your body better than anybody else in terms of how you feel in it. And you want to be able to feel that you're connecting with a trusted professional who's listening to your gut check. And also, you can trust their medical knowledge. If you don't feel right, get a second opinion.
Well said. So, in closing, where do you want this conversation to go? What do you want to happen with this book? As you mentioned, we've come far, but still have a ways to go when it comes to women's health.
Well, first of all, let me thank you for having me on. I mean, the fact that we're having this discussion really signals what I think is happening in society right now, which is that while there are dark points to it, there's also lots of bright light where people are taking tremendous interest in women's health. You see the Women's Health Initiative from the White House, where there are investing in women's health. Academic institutions, for example, I just left my prior institution. I'm now going to be at NYU, where I'm going to help them build a women's research institute and program there, which I'm so excited about. Across the country, you see more investments in academics in terms of women's health. You see medical curricula recognizing that women's health is not an elective, but that if you're a gastroenterologist or you're going to be an orthopedic surgeon, you need to know what menopause is too. It's not just something that we should be making the purview of gynecologists. Startups, women's health investing, companies, venture capital, biotech, there's tremendous groundswell and excitement about this. And I think there's lots of reason to have hope moving forward.
Amen. Elizabeth, thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.